Well, last night we had taken a slightly different approach to Philippians from what is commonly done, not just to be weird, but to try to follow the text. Our assumption was that most people read Philippians and find some extremely quotable verses, and that's basically what Philippians is for them. It's like the book of Psalms. We don't really read all of those, really. We find our favorite 23rd or 100th and whatnot, and we pick and select. And people do that with Philippians. And I had mentioned last night that I had found all of the love letters that my father and mother wrote to one another back in the 30s. Well, I was going through some of those, but you know, when a boy reads his deceased parents' love letters, he doesn't go through and find a sentence or two. You read those things. Years ago, I had a friend who had the information come out that for 30 of their 38 years of marriage, he had been having sexual relations with six of their best friends. It just threw dust up in the air all over everywhere. I mean, it was like a bombshell. Well, instead of getting his act together, became very hardened, brittle, in-your-face type of guy. And that summer, I was invited to go to Greece and was on the faculty of the American School of Classical Studies there in Athens for the summer. But I was very interested in this guy's choices and how he was dealing with the crisis that had now hit. I wrote 2 letters back to him. You don't have any idea how much time I sweated over words here and there, because in that situation, people can hear you talk for 2 hours, as he did for me, and pull out the 1 or 2 sentences that seem to support him, and that's all he got out of my 2 hours. I knew that's what he'd do with my letters, and I didn't want him to read my letters and pull out the 1 or 2 things that he could turn around and justify what he was wanting to justify. I wanted him to read my whole letter and get the whole point. And the reason for saying that is, when Paul wrote the book of Philippians, I don't think he wanted to say, how many good verses can you find in this letter? I don't think that's why he wrote it. He wrote it because this church, which he feels very close to, has a very serious problem. And I think he wanted them to hear, when this thing is read that morning in church in Philippi, he wanted that church to hear every single thing that's said and not pick out a thing here or there that could justify their side of things or their view on things. That being said, for those of you not here last night, we started in chapter 1 with verses 3 through 8, where he very lovingly and almost gushingly says, I love you, I can't wait to be with you, you're my favorite people, all this kind of stuff. And then in verse 9, he says, this is what I pray for, that your love might increase more and more in all knowledge and discernment. And we were asked the question, why would a guy pray that for people that he cared so much about? If everything was a bed of roses, why would verse 9 be his prayer? Now, the things that follow that were, if you get your love together in all knowledge and discernment, this will follow, this will follow, this will follow, down in verses 10 and 11. But the basic prayer in verse 9, that your love might increase more and more. That raised a question for us. Why would he do that? Then we went to chapter 4, verse 2, where 2 women were mentioned, each of them called by name, and each of them getting a very special verb that said, I'm telling you to get your act together with her, and you to get your act together with her. So there's been a falling out in the congregation. We raised the question last night, do people ever have a private fuss? No, things are said, sides are taken, people get bent out of shape, People don't talk to one another. Things go screwy. We also said the little town of Philippi last night is hardly more than a quarter of a mile long and basically over 200 yards wide. It's a little small town. I have some friends here today who live in a little small town. I'm going to ask a question of Kathy. Do people in your little town know what everyone else is thinking? No kidding. I grew up in a little small town in Arkansas just like that. There was no way to have a private corner of your life. Everyone knew everyone else's business in those little, okay, Philippi, they do too. They do too. They see this church, which claims to be the people of God, not talking to one another, fussing, disturbed. Okay. How in the world can that be anything joyful? How can it be anything with eternity written on it? They're not ready for Gabriel. They don't want him even practicing on that horn. You know, it's not, they don't want to see eternity right now. This thing is not together. All right. Now, usually, let me put it this way. Last night I mentioned being in Jackson, Mississippi, and that elder's wife wrote a book on how Philippians is the epistle of joy. And I came in unwittingly and said, no, these people are all bent out of shape. This is an epistle where it's all gone to pot. And I mentioned she still fed me lunch anyway. Well, in her little book on epistles, Philippians being an epistle of joy, she had made a comment on the name of one of these women. Now, remember in 4:2, I urge you, Euodia, and I urge you, Syntyche. She made a point on Euodia. In Greek, she said, not being able to read a sentence herself, in Greek, Euodia means a sweet smell. So she said, Euodia was a sweet smell before her Lord. Not knowing she had written that, I said, look, people, we don't know what the girl smelled like. You know, a name is a name. You can look online today and find out what Sue means and what Carroll means and whatnot, you know, in some obscure language or something or other. Hey, her name was Euodia, you know. We're named Bill, we're named Bob, and it's just a name. We don't go back. My mother didn't go back and research what the word Carroll means when she named me that. All she knew was that was my grandfather's name. That's good enough for her. All right. Names don't carry a lot of meaning. And all of this garbage about Euodia being a sweet smell before her Lord is so much of the typical garbage that is printed about the book of Philippians. It obscures the main message of the book, which is Euodia and Syntyche have had a falling out. And things have gotten bent out of shape further there, and it's gotten out into the little village. Town of Philippi knows all about this. And accuracy is never an issue. When people have a falling out, things are said that are not even a part of it. And aside comments begin to snowball, and all of a sudden this rumor goes, and then that rumor goes, and there's probably more rumor going on than truth. So the whole thing just gets balled up. And when we read Philippians, we're reading a letter from a guy who really cares about these people to something that is just as balled up as it can be. So we said last night in verses 12 through 26, he immediately jumps into his situation. Well, commentaries are kind of bewildered sometimes about why he would do that. And he said, well, it has nothing to do with the rest of the book. It's just that sometimes when you're in a dire dilemma, you need to dump on somebody. So there are commentaries out there that will say, verses 12 through 26, nothing to do with Philippians. He's just dumping on them about being in prison wrongfully, and people saying bad things about him and getting him in prison on false pretenses and all of that sort of stuff and whatnot. So you just kind of ride through it and let him dump and then get on into Philippians. And I said last night, no, he's not dumping. He's telling them that just like Euodia says, she is accusing me falsely. She's messing my world up with what she's saying, and so on. He said, I'm in prison because they are accusing me falsely. They're doing me dirt. But look how I'm handling it in prison. I can still talk about Christ in this prison cell. I can take what is a dire situation, because I may even get killed over this, but I can turn that into something good. And that's how I'm handling my dilemma. And he throws this in as a model for them in their dilemma. You don't have to keep making things worse. You can back off if you, what did he say in verse 9? If you think, if you discern what's the good and the bad way to go about this, if you take the better way, you walk the high road, you can deal with this like I am. So he doesn't just dump on them. He uses his dire circumstances as a model for how they can face their dire circumstances. And then in verse 27, he lowers the boom in the introduction of this book with a statement. And we said in verse 27, the word only in some older translations, and the whatever happens in maybe some of the newer translations, is a word used in Greek to get everybody's attention focused. So he gets their attention focused, and he says, you need to conduct yourselves as citizens in that town worthy of the gospel of Christ. And the word used for conduct yourselves is a special word for how you conduct yourselves in a communal setting, in Philippi. Okay. And he says, so that whether I'm there or whether I'm here, I hear that you stand united. And he says that twice. Stand in one spirit, striving with one soul. The whole focus is on getting the unit, that you get together as a church, and that you're not put off by your adversaries. For those of you here last night, many of the commentaries will say that the adversaries were some people who came into town from out somewhere and taught them a bunch of garbage and so on. They need to get rid of the false teachers. And we said, well, interesting theory, but there are no false teachers mentioned in the book. So we won't bring them in until they show up in the book. And other than that, we'll explain the book on the basis of the adversaries in town. And my comment last night went back to Acts 16. When the church was first started there, there was a bad PR from the beginning. They were thrown into prison. There was a kind of an uproar in town because of some guys saying, these people have come in teaching a bunch of stuff that is taking our money away and that sort of thing. The church didn't have a good press in Philippi to start with. So he said, if you get your act together, then you won't in any way be put off of what you're really trying to do by these people over here taking a negative view toward you. And furthermore, if you get your act together, you'll win. And they won't get you. If you don't get your act together, they'll win. You'll lose. You'll frazzle out and be nothing. So, he says, you've been given in Philippi a difficult circumstance. If you live there, you're going to face hardships simply because of the town being what it is, as opposed to Christianity. You're going to have troubles. You're going to suffer some. So he said, when you do that, just make sure you do it, what did he say, like I do? The last two verses there say, I want you to face your suffering like I face mine. And that's why this all ties together to make the introduction of the book. I'm facing a hard time. You're facing a hard time. Let's work this out. Now, in chapter 2, he begins to get into how he's going to suggest they do that. But for the benefit of those of you who were not here last night, chapter 4, verse 2 is a part of a structure in the Greek language. It occurs several times in the Greek New Testament to give a kind of a point to the book, to give the reader a very good idea, a tip-off about what the writer's doing. When this happens, you have the word that occurs twice there in chapter 4, verse 2. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche. That word urge is one of 4 different words that could be used in Greek to say, this is my point. it always has a background that leads into it. It always has something that follows it that says exactly what he's urging them to do. And it always is followed by a discussion of some sort about giving the reason for. Here's the reason we are concerned about this. There's an example in the whole book of Ephesians. Chapters 1 through 3 is a background. In chapter 4, verse 1, I urge you to walk worthy of your calling. 4, and the last 3 chapters of Ephesians give all of that ethical material about how the church is missing the boat in Ephesus. The whole book is built on that. Colossians is built on it. My stars there. Whenever this I urge you crops up, you kind of need to pause on that a little bit and think about, okay, now what he says right after that, I need to really pay some attention to. To walk worthy of your calling or whatever. Here, to walk worthy of the gospel. Okay. That means that chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Philippians are leading into something. And where we left it last night is that something is 2 women are going to have their name mentioned when this letter is read at the church. That's tough. That's a tough moment. So Paul is going to write this introduction a little bit longer than you might think, because that's a tough one. And then we suggested last night, and we'll get into that this morning, that when he gets down to the end of chapter 2, he's almost ready to write 4:2, and then he stops and he says, no, to go over the same thing again would be helpful for you, and it's not very difficult for me. So he takes chapter 3 as another stab at trying to get this thing ready to write the hard verse of 4:2. You 2 women get your act together, and the church gets its act together. So I guess, man, it's almost like a guy talking. He's nervous. He'd rather eat a bug than do what he's got to do. You know, so he spends time getting ready and whatnot. I was like that before I asked my wife to marry me. Everybody knew the question was coming. I had to talk to her father. We were in their living room. It went on and on. Program after program went on the TV. It went on and on because this very difficult statement had to be made, and the guy that was going to make it wasn't ready to make it. It went on and on. We talked about hunting. We talked about fishing. We talked about what? Finally, he looked over at me and he said, boy, do you have something to talk to me about? Now, Paul is kind of like that here. I mean, to write 4:2 is not your average sentence. That's a tough one. And you want to make sure, because it's so loaded, that you've got the ground pretty well prepared before you plant. So now he's going to start into chapter 2, getting this appeal together. Notice how he does it. If there is any, encouragement in Christ, that differs in translations. If there's any incentive to love, if any spiritual fellowship, if any compassion, and then there's another word that means the same thing. If any compassion, make my joy full by being of the same mind, being of the same mind, being of the same mind, being of the same mind. Now, let's go back and take a little look at how he jumps into this. What we have here is a list of things that count. Now, remember back earlier in chapter 1, in that prayer, chapter 1, verses 9, 10, and 11? What did he say? If you have more love for one another, you'll be able to do what? Discern. Discern. Okay, now look, when you have a fuss, what happens to discern? Discern goes out the window when you have a fuss. People don't have a fuss and sit around trying to figure out what's the best thing to do or say here. Oh, it's shooting from the hip. It goes bad. It goes south real quick. So he asked them to have more love with what? More knowledge and discernment. Okay. He wants them to stop and think. So what he gives them here is a list of things that count But now think about the flip side of that. When you have a fuss, what happens to encouragement in Christ? No, that goes out the window. Encouragement of almost any kind goes out the window. What happens to incentive to love? That goes out. See, this is a list of things not only that count, this is a list of things that don't count when you have a fuss. Look at the third one. What happens to spiritual fellowship, relationship, when things go wrong? What happens to compassion? Feeling for the other person. See, that goes out the window when you have a fuss. Now he said, if these things count, and in your better moments, your reasoning would say they do. Knowledge would say these things count. But in a fuss, they get lost in the shuffle, and they go out the window. Now, if these things do count, and they would have to admit they do, make my joy full, and then he says 4 times, being of the same mind, having the same love, being of the same mind. Now, why would he go through all of that? And we said last night, Greek does not have a punctuation mark. It has no way to underline something to make it more important. We said that is the way Greeks erase their words. It has no way to write it in capital letters because Greek at this time was only written in capital letters. Everything was capital letters. They didn't have italic script. How do you emphasize something in Greek? You say the same thing several times. Bang, 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 bang. Now, he's already done that with 2 other times earlier in chapter 1, where he said the same thing twice. That's an emphasis. Here he says it 4 times as if to say, how could I say this any stronger? If these things count, make my joy full by getting your act together and being united. And then the sentence continues. It might not in your English translation because Paul writes long sentences with a lot of commas. And your English Bible will have a lot more sentences and a lot more periods to help you kind of follow things. But in Greek here, this runs on. Doing nothing out of strife and vainglory. Now, we know what strife is. I have to pause a bit on the vainglory. My students would always, be able to say, well, thank goodness I don't do that, don't even know what it is. Well, vainglory, it's not a word that we normally use nowadays. How many times do you hear the word vainglory? It's an old word. It's an old word. But here's how you translate the word in Greek. It's that little puffed up attitude that you have in a fuss. Get rid of the strife and all of this attitude. But in every way, make yourselves humble. Right. What? Among one another? Humble yourselves among one another? Is that what it's saying here? Show humility among one another? Yeah, okay. You show humility among one another. Now, the verse 4 is where you've gone to, right, Kathy? Yeah, okay. The first, into verse 3. Okay, considering others better than yourself, may be what some of your translations are reading. Okay. Now, if you have that idea, you might think of a ladder where everyone else is higher up the ladder and I'm just down here at the bottom and don't count. Wrong idea for humility. Jesus never taught that one of his followers should go around feeling dejected and worse than everybody else. That is not a teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. That is not humility either. I mean, we send people to counselors to get cured of that sort of stuff. Okay? This idea of being worthless and everybody else counts and I don't, that's not humility. what it is considering others ahead of yourself. You have your preferences. We don't all have the same preferences. You consider the other person ahead of yourself. It's not like I have to have my way all the time. Hey, you want to do it your way? We'll do it your way. I'll get my turn. Humility, in the Christian way of looking at it, is getting along. You know? Okay. That's the Christian view of humility, is that you defer. And there's actually a word used in the relations between a man and a woman in Ephesians, that their relationship should be one of mutual deference. They defer to one another. And that's what Paul says to the Ephesians would make a marriage work. You defer to one another. She doesn't always defer to him. He doesn't always defer to her. It's a mutual thing. Now this, sometimes that. It works this way, it works that way. We get along. And this is more about that, I think, Becky, than a ladder type of thing. All right. So the sentence continues. And what do you have in verse 4? Does it not say that very thing? Each of you looking out for the best interest of others and not just your own stuff? See, verse 4 explains what verse 3 means. That's what humility, verse 4 is what he means by this humility. Now in verse 5 we start that famous so-called Christ hymn, which has been, I think, the most quoted of the Pauline writings over 2,000 years. It is just prominent. It has almost a standalone quality to it. Now, it starts off in verse 5, have this mind in you which was in Christ Jesus. Now, years ago, when I was a student at Vanderbilt University, a part of my work there was to construct a Bible translator's handbook on Philippians. That is, to go through the material in the library and conduct this tome of stuff on Philippians that would be useful to Bible translators among primitive people. Okay. So I went through the Vanderbilt Library and stuff almost back to the 1800s, early 1800s, French, German, English, everything I could find on Philippians. And I compiled all of this verse-by-verse stuff. I contacted the Wycliffe Bible translators, and they sent me out to Arizona. A man by the name of Dean Saxton and his wife Lucille were translating for the Papago Indian people out west of Tucson. So I went out and spent a summer on the Papago Reservation with this tome of stuff from Vanderbilt. And Dean and his Indian helper, Miss Susie Enos, found my work to be relatively useless. They were asking questions about Philippians that commentators had not been asking since 1800. Well, I went back to Vanderbilt and reported to my professors, and they said, well, you just sit on what you have, because when the translators wise up and start asking the right questions, you'll be ready. Okay. Wrong answer, by the way. Because when you're translating the New Testament into the language of another people, there are all kinds of issues that arise that the commentary tradition just does not even ask. And one of the things we're doing here today is we're asking those questions of Philippians because probably a third of what we've done so far is not in the commentary tradition. We've just been asking different questions rather than the inherited questions. Okay? This has come out of working with Philippians in probably a couple of dozen different tribes down through the Americas. And my Bible has all kinds of notations in it. Not about what Philippians means, but about questions that the Indians were asking about a verse that I didn't even know the question existed and had to go back and ask that question. Okay. And with Dean Saxton out there, I will never forget, we translated Philippians 2:5, have this mind in you which is in Christ Jesus. We translated Jesus Christ. That's what we told them. And it just means you should think like Jesus. But after I found out what Philippians was doing, that's not a good question, not a good translation. It's really not. For one thing, it says, have this mind in you. Which one? Well, the one I'm about to say. It doesn't just say, go have the mind of Christ, like we preach it devotionally. It has this mind, this specific mind. And what one is that? Well, it says that he had everything with God all together. It was a perfect world. But he came down here and took on himself the form of a man, being vulnerable to people. And in that vulnerability, people killed him. He died. But God raised him to his right hand and gave him the name above every name, which is the name Lord, that at that name every knee should bow, every tongue should confess that he is Lord, and so on. That mindset. Now let's think about it for a moment. The mindset where he had it with God in a perfect world, and God said, go down there and live among them. And I have, as a father, often wondered what God must have felt like as his son left the threshold of heaven and went down to a very troubled world. A very troubled world. You know, it would be almost like me saying to my daughter, I would like for you to go to the backside of Kenya or Uganda. We were talking last night. Just go to the backside. Go up to the north part where the Lord's Liberation Army is. What would a father feel like if his daughter was going to live for a few years there? You know. But at any rate, aside from what the feelings of God might have been, Jesus did come here, and people misunderstood him, misinterpreted him. They accused him of doing what he did by the power of demons. They did all kinds of stuff to this man. They finally caught him. They put him through a mock trial, and they killed him. But God took out of that something good and made him Lord over all. Now we know that, and it's a good devotional story. But what's it doing in here? Well, notice what it follows. In humility, you start looking out for the best interests of others. Well, this Jesus of Nazareth did that. Not looking out for his own best interest, looking out for the best interests of others. How far did he do that? All the way. He went a lot further than most would. You know. But God took out of it something good. Now, in a fuss, of what value is this view of Jesus? He humbled himself. He became obedient. He was an example of that humility he has just talked about, looking out for the best interest of others. When he was done wrong, he didn't lash out, create a big fuss. You know, he kept doing what he took the high road, paid a price for it. But sometimes in a dispute, taking the high road, you do pay a price. It's not always easy. And sometimes in a fuss, when things start going all awry, you want to be watered down a hill. You want to take the easiest course. You don't want to face reality. You don't want to face the hard. Sometimes people will do anything except look the other person in the eye. That's why they don't walk on the same side of the street. That's why they don't talk to one another. They are afraid of what the other person will do, what the other person will say. They don't want that awkward moment. But now Jesus faced his realities by keeping his head on straight, knew what he was trying to do. He was thoughtful about it all. He was discerning. He knew what the right thing to do was, and he did it all the way to the end. Jesus is in there as an example. Okay, now these people are Christians. They follow who? Christ. They follow who? Well, well, maybe they're not following Christ. They're following their own inclinations in this fuss. And he throws this in to say, if you're going to be a follower of Christ, follow Christ. Here's the example he gave us. In his tough times, he did it right. Now, that's what we're going to do here. So, in verse 12, he has a what? So then, he picks back up on what he left off in verse 4. So then, in terms of this humility and whatnot, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not only when I was there, but now much more in my absence, with fear and trembling work out your own salvation. Now, the fear and trembling doesn't pose much problem, because you know what it is when you have a fuss and you're in the very presence of the person you detest so much. You are physiologically different. Your breathing is different. Tone of your voice is different. Your knees shaking is a little bit different. You know? Years ago at a school at which I taught, there was a professor on the faculty with whom I differed on almost everything, and he differed with me on virtually everything. In faculty meetings, the dean was almost ready to pull his hair out. I know this for sure, in heaven there will be no faculty meetings. An incident came up in that town where this fellow was trying to get a number of churches in town to pull out their support for the Christian school that existed in that town, because one of the young men who had spoken in their chapel had done something that he disagreed with, and he was all bent out of shape about it and created this big fuss. There was a group of people of, 400 or 500 people together in this auditorium to discuss this situation. And he was just about to get them to pull their support out as a threat. If they don't fire this kid and get him off their campus, we're going to pull out our support. It was a ploy. Near the end of that meeting, I stood up and made 2 or 3 comments. And as a young professor, not knowing any better, should have had more quaking knees than I did. But it defused the situation, and the churches kept their support of the school. But the next morning, this guy stomped into our building, stomped past my office, and oh boy, we're going to have a day here for sure. Well, I figured, what am I going to do? I went up and knocked on his door. Knees were quaking. Bigger than I am for sure. Everybody's bigger than I am. He was a big guy. And I remember when he said, "Who's there?" I said something like, "It's Carroll." I went in. The guy was there behind his desk. We had a little conversation and whatnot. Upshot was we went out to lunch. And we did not agree on that or anything else, but we agreed this: we will have lunch together regularly. Your students don't like my students don't like your students, but they will see the 2 of us at lunch regularly. We never talked about religion because we disagreed on it so much. But until I left there, we had lunches together regularly. This man was going to have a surgery in which they were losing 9 out of 10 people. My wife, being a surgical nurse, went to him and said, "Your chances are 1 out of 10. But there is a doctor in this town who is saving 9 out of 10. Would you like his phone number?" Now, excuse me here for being just a tad emotional, but this guy and I couldn't stand one another. But we found a way to walk together. Simply because I had been teaching Philippians, and the message was, if you're going to follow Christ, then for goodness sakes, follow Christ. Bite the bullet. Go ahead and do it. So then, my beloved, with the fear and trembling that comes, go ahead and work your salvation. It means put it to work. You've been brought into a saving situation. Let it work for you. This is what Christianity is all about. Put it to work. Work your salvation. God is doing His part, verse 13. God is working to bring about salvation as He would like. So, in verse 14, what are you to do? Do all without grumbling and fussing. And not do that either. It's an imperative. Stop the grumbling and fussing. It's a present imperative. Remember I taught Russ? You normally use a past tense imperative if you're just going to use an imperative in Greek. But if you use a present tense, it means cut it out. This is a present tense. Cut out the grumbling and the fussing. Now, when we underline quotable verses in Philippians, we don't underline 14, do we? In fact, we don't even know 14 is in Philippians. We read right over it. It's kind of like an old professor I used to have says we're plowing along, we hit a rock, back up, move on over it. So we just move on over 14. Now look, people, if what we're doing here has any credibility at all, verse 14 is the point of the book. Stop the grumbling and the fussing is where he's headed in 4:2. It's the problem. Now stop it. So that you can be blameless and blameless, children of God among a perverse generation, among whom you shine as stars in the light. Now they're in Philippi. It's a classy town. Oh, it's a colony. It's upscale. And there is major east-west traffic right beside their city square. The world passes by Philippi. And it's a neat place to be. But it's not Christian. It's an unchristian town. And these people are to be there in that town, what? Shining like stars? Okay. There's a little bit of skewing going on here in this town. Now, a few years ago, I started a scout troop in Abilene, Texas. We did most of our camping on ranches out in West Texas. Stars are brilliant out there at night. You get away from the city lights. Kids didn't know there were that many stars in the sky. Have them spread their blankets or sleeping bags out on the ground. I had a 6-cell flashlight lying on our backs. I could say, now there's Orion's head, and a beam of light from that flashlight would go all the way up to Orion's head, and I could point out Orion. And we'd do the other stars. We'd do the other constellations and so on. We taught these little kids how to read the stars. Well, as a part of their second-class requirements, we'd take them, 2 or 3 miles away and dump them out. And they had to find their way back to camp. Wasn't hard because there was a mesa over there on the south side. I mean, you keep the mesa on your right, you're going to find the camp. But they weren't smart enough to figure that out. They were reading the stars. And every year that I was out there, these little kids, I'd never had a kid that didn't find his way back to camp by reading the stars. Now, the children, the boys, always did their own worship services. They'd come to me on Saturday night and say, this is what we're going to do the next day. And I would approve it, but then they would do their own worship services, whatnot. Well, one time, one of these little boys came up with the idea of this verse, among whom we shine as stars in the light. And they did the worship service the next day. I had done Philippians for my doctoral dissertation at Vanderbilt University. But I did not know what this kid taught me. I had never heard what he taught me that morning. He said, now, I think this verse means that if the stars are where they are doing what they're supposed to do, we can count on them and find our way. So he said, it's not how bright they shine, it's where they are. If they're where they're supposed to be, doing what they're supposed to be doing, people can count on them. And he said, that's the way we ought to be this next week. And I thought, my goodness, you ought to give this kid a PhD. I mean, this is good stuff. Because it's exactly the point. It's not that they're to be in Philippi shining so brilliantly. They should be there shining where they're supposed to be, so that the Philippians can take a look at them and see how they're supposed to be. But if they're all disheveled like this, the Philippians look at them and don't have a clue what they're supposed to be. So I think verse 14 and 15 go together to say, stop the grumbling and the fussing, in order that you might be blameless and being the kind of people in Philippi that you are supposed to be before those people. Okay? Now, Paul at this point goes through 3 verses where he begins to talk about him being in prison, his probable death going up. He says he's language like he's poured out on the altar and that sort of thing, which is language for being killed. Right? But he says at the end in verse 18, I want you to rejoice and rejoice with me. Now the only thing I can think of here is that perhaps he's gone back to his example earlier. I'm in prison, and I'm appealing to you to get your act together, to be the kind of people in Philippi you ought to be, like I'm trying to be the kind of guy in prison that I ought to be. And if you do that, I can rejoice and you can rejoice. And even if I'm killed, you can rejoice over that idea. Okay, that we're all of us are doing what we're supposed to do. Now, our time is up at this point, so we're going to pick up at 19 and we're going to finish this book in the next hour. Is that okay? All right, okay. I'm going to make a comment, sort of, but unrelated to Philippians that came up during the intermission. In the Greek Bible, sometimes sentences go on for 24 and Paul was really bad about that. You can read and read and read and read and read and read and finally get a period. And an example of that is found in the opening part of Ephesians. I think it starts around verse 3, and then it goes down for about half of that chapter before you have a period. And then you pick up sentence number 2, and it goes to the end of the chapter, and you've had your second period. And then chapter 2 starts off and goes through verse 8, and so now you're in the middle of chapter 2, and you've only had 3 sentences. So it's a Greek student's nightmare to try to diagram that thing on a board. It can't be done, really. Now, in English translations, the translators have adapted those sentences so that you, the English-speaking reader, can read the shorter sentences and understand better. You don't get lost in all of that stuff. So your English Bible will have more sentences in it, and some of those have more than others. There is an older translation that would be called the New American Standard Translation. It essentially follows the structure of the Greek. It's very difficult to read because of that. If it had a verb, they put a verb. Had a noun, they put a noun. And they didn't put a period till they got to a period. In the New International Version, for instance, a long sentence like that might be broken up into 6 or 7 sentences. Now that's helpful for you, the English reader, but then you face the problem, which of those 6 or 7 sentences was the major sentence to start with, and you don't know that. And that's why in some of what we have done here this weekend, I have emphasized this or that in a sentence because that's the part of the sentence that Paul emphasized in his sentence. And the other parts of it may be independent sentences in your Bible, but they are qualifying sentences to that sentence. Okay. So in your English Bible, there's no right way to do it. It's just that if we're going to translate the Bible, we have to have shorter sentences in English. I was helping translate the Bible down in New Mexico, in Guatemala. There's a coast language down on the coast. A guy named Matt was translating down there. And they can have a noun and a verb, and each of those can have one modifier, like an adjective or an adverb, and you have to put a period. So we found ourselves with hundreds of sentences in that Bible, and then faced the problem, which of those sentences is the Indian going to pick up as the one major sentence and whatnot. And fortunately, most languages have a way of doing that. But here this weekend, I've tried to emphasize for you the sentences, the part of the sentences that were the crucial ones, and the others sort of modify what's happening. Okay. Now, in verse 19, we start off with him talking about Timothy and Epaphroditus coming to visit. This is visit talk. Now, in some of the commentaries, there is a bit of uncertainty about why you throw that in. Why in the world would he talk about sending these two guys up there? Timothy is a young boy he's picked up on this trip and is now a part of his traveling group. Epaphroditus, we'll find out in the text, was a native guy of Philippi. He grew up there. They know this boy. And he is with Paul. In this paragraph, Paul is lamenting the fact that most of the people who were around him have abandoned him, looking out for their own interests. Doesn't go into what that might be, but for some reason, these two guys are still hanging around with his prison cell and bringing him food and taking care of him, doing that sort of thing. Why would he do this at this point? Well, there is, in the Greek way of doing things, a thing called visit talk, which is more than just visit. It's a way of putting a little bit of pressure on the people to do what he's asking them to do that might be more difficult. Go ahead and do it. And here's how that happens. In the little book of Philemon, you have the problem with the guy and the slave. You remember the little story of Philemon? Okay. And Paul tells the master that he wants to treat this Christian slave like a brother instead of a piece of property. And he says near the end of the little book of Philemon, and by the way, I'm coming to visit you. Okay? It's like my dad leaving for work in the morning and saying, boy, I want the yard mowed today. And by the way, I'm coming home for lunch. You know, it's, okay. Now, what we have in verse 19 is him saying, I'm sending these two guys up there. One of them you don't know, but he is like a son to me, he says in there. This Timothy is really a major part of my life. You're going to have to deal with Timothy. Now, Epaphroditus, he says, is a native, and he's going to go up there and look out for your welfare too. Now, I suppose that one or the other of these guys is going to be bringing the letter. Remember, 1:1 said that Timothy was a co-author of the book with him. He doesn't actually write it out with Paul. Paul writes it in as a singular, as though he's doing it. But Timothy's obviously having input here. And Timothy's going to be, is one of them already sent? And one of them is going to be sent? Is that how I remember that? Okay. Now, the whole deal about everything down to verse 30, down to the end, is the intervention by a third party. So we have this group in Philippi, Euodia maybe, this group maybe Syntyche and that side of things. Well, Epaphroditus and Timothy are going to come to do some intervention, to be a kind of a leavening between the two disputing groups. I never will forget, and I have a note here in my Bible to that effect. When I was first beginning as a young professor, the dean of our school was asked to go to a town down in south of us, a major city, because the church down there had had a major split. He was asked to come down and do the intervention, but he couldn't go. So he says, Osburn, would you go? And here's this kid, wet behind the ears, fresh out of his PhD and whatnot, had no business doing intervention of any kind. But before I left, he had me write this in my Bible. Genuineness. If you're going to intervene, genuineness, honesty, confidentiality, integrity, objectivity, and gentleness. And with that, I got on a plane and went down to work with these people. But this wise older professor said, if you're going to do this, this is what you need to have in your arsenal. Now, I'm thinking that Epaphroditus and Timothy are sent there by Paul with that kind of an agenda in working with these people. They are not going to take sides. They're going to help people heal this the best they can. Now in 3:1, to move on, because we only have a little bit to finish this book. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. Now remember the deal that most people say Philippians is a book of joy. Well, in a way it is. But they're wrong by saying that they have it. Paul is saying you don't have it. Now, for goodness sake, get a healthy dose of it. Rejoice in the Lord. Mm-hmm. Now, this is where he backs off and says, "Oh, I'm not ready yet to call those two women's name. Is it not difficult for me? It would be better for you to go over the same ground again." Now, in verses 2 down through verse 11, he says there are people out there that act like dogs, treat you like dogs, and you've got to watch out for this. He brings up things about the circumcision, which people begin to say, well, now that may be Jewish. Well, has Lydia and her bunch attracted over the next few years some Jewish people into this community that have become a part of this problem? What is this business in here in verse 3 and so on about this circumcision deal? Or is it circumcision? What about the pagan people in whose religion often they did a lot of using whips on themselves and so on? And you're right, he brings up this idea here about walking by the Spirit and walking by the flesh. And that's what we want to get out of this briefly. Walking by the Spirit's a very different world from walking by what he calls the flesh, just a very human nature. And then he says he knows himself a good deal about that choice, because it's a matter of discernment, is it not, to walk one way or the other. Now, how do you walk one way or the other if you don't have knowledge, first of all? And isn't that what he said back in verse 9 of chapter 1? Have more love for one another with knowledge and discernment. So if you're going to get there, the first thing you have to do is get your head screwed on straight with what you're thinking. You have to know what is right. All right? You have to agree on that. Remember what he said in 2:1? If these virtues count, he wants to get them to the point where their head agrees, that does count. And if they can agree on the things that count, then it becomes a matter of discernment to decide between this and that. But if you're going to heal any kind of a dispute, we have to get our thinking straight, and then we have to get the way we make choices straight. And that's what I'm getting out of where he's headed right here. He says, I was, tribe of Benjamin, Pharisee of Pharisees, zealous persecutor of the church. Okay. Here's where his thinking was bad, he says. Here's where his discernment was not good. Throws himself in as an example of how it can go wrong. And then he says, in verse 7? But Christ becomes the real example. And that's what turned his thinking around and his choices around, as his example was in chapter 2. Christ is the example of how we ought to go. How he did this is how we ought to go about it. And I was telling last night a story to Becky, I think, about a young friend of mine who unfortunately is in a part of the country which is very fundamentalist. And she has been disfellowshipped from her church over a very minor matter that should have been resolved easily enough. But she's been disfellowshipped from her church. They sent letters out all around the countryside in the part of one state and this part of her state. She has been stopped the past several weeks at the door of churches. They will not let her and her young son come in the door of those churches. It is just a very, very sad situation. I've made trips up there. We're constantly texting one another. And last week, my text to her was, now remember, take the high road. And she typed back, yeah, the high road. She says, I'm taking the high road, but if I find a stick on it, can I beat the dickens out of them with it? You know? You know. Now, how we handle this kind of thing is so important. And all I've done with this young girl, not young, she's 40, is to say, follow the example of Jesus. When they did him wrong, how did he go about it? And she texts back, that's all that's keeping me afloat. You know, this is the way we do it. Paul says here, you can take everything I was away from me, but one thing you cannot take away, and that's Jesus. I must have Christ, or there's no way I can function. Now, if his idea is to get them back to good thinking, he doesn't send them to a book or to a list. He sends them just to Christ. That's his answer, which can only be, however he approached it, becomes our model for approaching it. And that's good thinking. That's good thinking. I must have Christ. I must know him, the power of his resurrection, fellowship of his sufferings, and how to be conformed to his death. Now look at that verse real closely. To know him. That's the sentence. The next three are specifics of how you know him. This is not a list of four. To know him, how? Well, the power of his resurrection. Well, now think about that for a moment. Power? What is it that's going to be strong enough to solve a dispute that's gotten this big? Well, if you say Christ is where we're going to go for this, he says him walking out of that tomb ought to be enough power for you to put your weight down on it. The resurrection story itself, if you believe it, ought to be enough for you to say, if he did that, I can do this. To know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. That is, how he met his trials. How he met these situations where people did him wrong. What was it like for him to stand there and have people accuse him of this and that and the other? How did he deal with that? And then how to be conformed to his death. Which I think is, how did he meet the cross? Well, in the gospel story, he didn't want it. In the garden, he prayed for 3 long hours that God find some other way to get it done. Now, earlier he had said, I must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, be killed, and rise the third day. That's his head speaking. But when you get right down to the end of it, he's looking at that as a very real thing happening here in a few hours. He doesn't want to do it. So he prays that God take it away from him. But there comes it's almost like arguing with God a bit. And I like classical music. And Beethoven's oratorio, The Mount of Olives, is one of my favorites. When I lived in Memphis, I sang with the Memphis Oratorio Society, and the Memphis Symphony played the music, and we had a 70-member oratorio society that sang these oratorios. We did 4 a year. We did the Elijah and some really good stuff. But one of my favorites was the Mount of Olives. Okay. Beethoven might not have been a theologian, but boy, he had a friend who was, for sure. Because Jesus is there struggling about what to do in the garden. He obviously doesn't want to do it. But when it comes to the point where he has to deal with reality, everything gets real quiet, and there's an ever so quiet, thy will be done. Decision's been made. If you're coming at me with a bunch of guys and whatnot, this is not an option anymore. I can argue with God and pray to God for hour after hour after hour, but if you're going to push me, hey, we're going to do it God's way. So he goes to the cross. Okay. Now, in fusses, we can find every way in the world except to do it the right way. We can fuss and fuss and fuss and turn this into that and whatnot, but what he's saying here is there comes a point where you've got to say, all right, we're just going to do it right. Period. We're going to bite the bullet and do it just because it's right. And we follow Jesus that way. But the other thing is, Jesus is on the cross in Beethoven's Mount of Olives. And he could have called, like that old gospel song says, 10,000 angels to come down and take him down, but he didn't. He stayed there for you and me. It's one thing to go to a cross, but there was still the option for Jesus on the cross to have come off of it. He chose to stay there. Now that's the important thing about how he conformed to his death, because even when you decide to do the right thing, there are a jillion answers and options to go back and jump back into the old pit. Do it the old wrong way. Keep it fouled up. What Jesus is all about is going to that cross and staying on that cross. And you just trust God to bring it out. But the deal is to go to that cross, and in the cross, you might get killed solving this problem. Well, when you get into a problem where people are bent out of shape with one another, of course, things can go wrong. Somebody can pull a 380 out of a hip pocket and blow you away. I mean, you have no idea. Things can go wrong. Well, Paul, I think, is saying you might have to face that to solve this problem. Go ahead and, how far did Jesus go to solve it? In essence, he's saying that's how far you go to solve it. Now, that's what makes this, for me, one of the toughest verses in the text in the Bible. Philippians is one really tough book when you get right down to the first level. Are you going to apply this or not? Are you going to follow Jesus in this or not? Are you willing to go? You wear that cross around your neck. Are you willing to think about what that means? You know? And by the way, I was doing this at a church down in one of the larger southeastern cities in our country, and just made that point and passed on over it. And I got a phone call the following week that 6 of the elders of the 20-some that they had were now talking again for the first time in years. They just decided to bite the bullet and do it. Now, look at verse 12. He has not gone to a different topic. He's just following right on that. He said, I don't count myself yet to have matured in this. I'm not really perfect at it myself. But I'll tell you what I do. I press on toward the prize. That's my goal. Pressing on toward the prize is not going to heaven. It's trying to get to the point where following Jesus is what you really do. Consistently. Not only when it's evil, but when it's hard, but when, it's easy to be a follower of Jesus when everything's going great. What makes a Christian is to follow Jesus when the going gets really bad, awful bad, is what Paul is saying. And essentially what he's saying about this forgetting the past and pressing on to the prize of the upward calling, that's just simply a matter of get over it and get on with the new. The upward calling is not heaven. The upward calling is the high road in this fuss. To get off the low road and take the high road. And it just simply means, okay, so this has been bad. This all has been said. I hate that. Well, get over it. And for me, going up that day to this fellow professor's office and knocking on his door was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Because you don't know what the guy's going to say or do because he's livid. But you walk out of there an hour later and you're having lunch together. That's where you trust the Almighty to do His part of it. You've got to do your part of it, Paul says, and that means forget the past, get on with the future here. He said, as many as are mature, verse 15 is not as many as are perfect do this. That word perfect can also mean mature, and it does here. As many as are mature, acting grown up instead of childlike, as many as are grown up, they act like this, and he says, I want you to do that too. Now, in verse 17, become imitators of me. This is the third time he's brought that up. Remember, he started off with, this is my situation and how I face it. He came back to it again, and now he says it a third time, become my imitators. Now you can see why he's running to rewrite this introduction and keep on with it, because that's what he's pushing on. Stop the fussing, follow Christ, and follow my example, is essentially what he has said so far. Now, in following his example, he follows through the rest of this chapter. Well, our time's getting away from us. But as you read the rest of this chapter, I think it will be fairly self-explanatory. Perhaps on verse 4, 1 of chapter 4, so then, my beloved, my joy, my crown, stand in the Lord. And I would underline in the Lord. Stand in Christ. And that's how he wraps up this whole thing. Now the conclusion of the book starts in chapter 4. And I forgot my outlining up here, and I apologize for that. But maybe we're together on all of this. Here's the conclusion of the book. But I'd have to make up a bunch of stuff if we went that far. Oh, okay. Well, if we can go a little bit longer, we're good. Okay, but let me go let me pick up here at the conclusion anyway. Everything that he has said so far leads up to him writing chapter 4, verse 2. Here he does the difficult thing. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to get it together in the Lord. Now, some years ago, I was helping the Wycliffe Bible translators translate Philippians down in the jungles of Guatemala. And there was a very marginally literate Mayan Indian by the name of Jose Maria Corvai. I wrote his name in my Bible. He was a Maya Mopan Indian. And he heard Philippians read for the first time by a guy named Matt Ulrich, who translated that book of Philippians for him. Well, Matt read Philippians orally to Jose Maria Corvai, and he asked him what the book was about, what the letter was about. And this Indian said, the two women. I had a doctorate from Vanderbilt University and didn't figure that out. But this Indian heard the story and figured out that's what the problem was. Now, if a marginally literate Indian who's never even read the book before can get it, why can't we? Because we have a long, long heritage of people telling us Philippians means something else. We're accustomed to hearing it's a book of joy. It's all of this stuff. But if you just read it, this is what it means. And I think of all of the years that I helped translate the New Testament into languages down in Central and South America, this was one of my favorite moments. I mean, how do you beat that? I urge Euodia, I urge Syntyche to get it together in the Lord, and I urge you, true yoke fella, get in there between them and help them work it out. Now, who is true yoke fella? Well, either Timothy or Epaphroditus. One of those guys is going up there to be the moderator in all of this. Work together with Clement and the others whose names are in the book of life. Now look at verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always, and I'm telling you people one more time, get some joy. And that's a different way of translating it from what we did here. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. And we can wing off in another world on that. We can just wax eloquent on that verse devotionally. But if you leave it in this book, it means you people need a double dog dose of joy over there. Now go get some. Let your gentleness be known among all men. Is that not what your verb is there? Let it be known? Does it say something like that? Let it be known? Now that is translated as a subjunctive. You should do this. In the Greek Bible, that is a second person imperative. In our language, it's a third person imperative. In our language, we only have second persons. You do it or y'all do it, but it's an imperative. We don't have a third person. He do it, but Greek does. And very often how it's used is, it must be done. Not he do it or whatnot, but it must be done. This is not a suggestion. It's not a subjunctive. It's an imperative. Your gentleness must be known among all people. Now that gentleness is a very interesting word. Last year when we did Titus, I went through Aristotle's explanation of gentleness. Now, we're not going to do that whole thing today, but in the Greeks, to be too hot-headed was bad. To be too much mealy-mouthed, wimpy, was bad. You wanted the golden mean. Sometimes you need a bit of temper, but you need to have it under control. I mean, there are certain situations that happen where I think any decent human being would come unglued because that's just evil. You want to stop that. Okay. But even then, you need to be in control of yourself. So this word that we call gentleness, or meekness sometimes in translations, is a word used in Greek for a powerful horse. It's so powerful that it can ride right through the enemy in battle unafraid, but it's so tamed and in control that children can ride on its back in the yard. It's a word used of a powerful guard dog that's so vicious it could rip an intruder apart. But it's so tamed that the children can wrestle with it on the floor. It's strength under control. This word, so often translated gentleness or meekness, comes across to us as let your wimpiness be known. No. He's wanting them to be strong. What is their problem? It's not under control. If you can get your emotions under control, get your head under control, get yourself under control, there's a time for you to cut loose. But just because Euodia shows up is not a good reason, you know. So let your gentleness be known. And then Aristotle goes on to explain that word. You can cut loose with it, let your power come unglued against the right person, the right manner of time, the right way and whatnot. There's a way to do it. But you need to be very careful when you let your power come unglued. So if you have an idea here that this verse means let your wimpiness be known, or that that's even a Christian virtue, it's not. Let your gentleness be known among all. The Lord is near. Now that could be the afterlife, or that could be the availability of Christ to this mess is very close to you. You can reach out and get it if you wish. Now let's go to verse 6. What is the opening part of verse 6 in your translations? Do what? Do not be anxious. It actually means stop the anxiety. And when you have a fuss, anxiety is written all over it. Isn't that what stress is all about? I mean, that's why we go to the counselor. Stress is written all over this. Stop the stress. Stop the anxiety. Cut it out. And in every way, with prayer, let your prayer be made known to God. You know, you turn this into something where you and God are working together on something. And if you do, the peace of God that passes all understanding will show up. Now, this is a perfect example of where when we have conflict, we want peace. And Paul essentially says you can't get peace. You can do some other things right and peace will show up. But you can't get peace. There is no way to go get peace. You just do it right and peace shows up. And I don't know how many times in my life that lesson has been learned the hard way. Because we keep trying to do it our way instead of getting our head and our prayer life and everything together and getting our head screwed on straight and just doing the right thing. And if we do that, what we want shows up. We get the gentleness and the peace and the patience. And if these things count, we get those. They show up. It's almost like a friend of mine whom I dated in college said to me about the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. You know, whoever has this fruit of the Spirit has this long list of things. And I was despair. I said, you know, there is no way I have even a start on that list. I don't know that I could ever have all of those. And she said, and she was 2 years younger than I, but she said, I don't know that you need to have all of those like a tree that just has them dangling out there like fruit on an apple tree. She said, it seems to me that what you need is to have that fruit when you need it. You need kindness when kindness is called for. It's not like you go around just kindness written all over you, but patience. You need patience when it's called for. You need self-control when it's called for. And I think that was a very good way of looking at Galatians 6, and I think it's probably a good way of looking at the conclusion of Philippians. You do these things, and some things will then flow out of that. Look at verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever is, and we have this long list, pure and sensible and just and righteous and holy and all of this kind of thing, lovely and good report. If there's any excellence or any praise, think on these things. Think on these things is put these things in there as these are the virtues that you mentally agree to. These are things that you theoretically agree are good. You got to start there. Get your head screwed on straight. And then he says in verse 9, you need to practice these things. Is that right? Get your head screwed on straight and then make choice. Discern. Choose the good. I taught my scouts. There are several ways you can build a fire. Many of those will burn the woods down. But if you do it this way, you can cook your food. There's a way to help someone in an accident who has a broken leg. Many of those ways will result in them having to lose the leg when the doctor gets to them. But if you do it this way, there's a good chance the doctor might be able to save them. You know, there's a way to do first aid. Now, I'm working with a generation of kids that really don't see parameters of any kind much out there. They don't see controls, and there's a generation coming along that doesn't see a lot of rules and regulations. Well, in scouting, we find that there are some better and worse ways to do some things. That's called discernment. So one of the things in helping a little 11, 12, 13-year-old boy to do is to help him learn to make wise choices. Here's how you can choose to build a fire. Here's how you choose to do first aid. Here's how you choose to do ta-da. But it's your choice. And you grow up and do it that way. I think that's what Paul's saying here. Look at your options. Make your choices. And practice it. And look what he says. And if you do, the peace of God will be with you. It's a matter of getting your head screwed on, making wise choices, and the peace that we all want here in Philippi will show up. There is an old hymn by Cleland McAfee. There is a place of quiet rest, what, near to the heart of God. Every little thing, there is near to the heart of God. Okay, it's a great hymn. It's one of only two that I have written in my Bible that I take with me. You can't get far away from that. That if you want that place of quiet rest, you're not going to find it any other place than somewhere around the mind of God. And I think that's what Paul is doing here at the end, is saying, you people pull your choices together God will work with you and the peace will just show up. And at that point, the book is over. Philippians is gone. But we have verses 10 and following as a kind of a postscript. Oh, and we have some quotable verses in there. We want to take a good look at those. Okay. What we have, I know how to be abased and how to abound. Is that one of our quotable verses in verse 12? Yeah. But now look at it in terms of this book. He knows what it's like to ride the wind and be on top of things as he's done all around the Mediterranean. He knows what it's like to be thrown into a prison and deal with the dark side of things. He knows how to be abased and how to abound. He knows, what is it, verse 13? How does that read in your text? 13? I can do it. Does that mean jump over tall buildings with a single bound? Stop a speeding train faster than a speeding bullet? What can you do here? I can do everything. I have heard that verse more misused than you can point a stick at. No, it doesn't mean you can stop a speeding train or that you can leap a mountain. No. What is he talking about? Facing your difficulties, whatever those might be, I can deal with that. I can deal with that. In terms of this book, this is a matter of relationships, is it not? The whole book is about relationships. I can deal with relationships through Him who strengthens me. I think verses 10 through 14 are so often taken out of Philippians. And even though it is a kind of a P.S. in the book, Paul says some good stuff here. In this verse and what follows, he says, I am grateful that you people in Philippi have sent money to me time and again. In my ministry and in my imprisonment, you have helped me to survive. He said, I am so grateful to you people. And he just praying that God will somehow work with them to get all of this done. And look at verse 21. Greet the saints. Those that are with me, greet you. How do you end a book like this? The grace of Jesus be with your spirits. As we have walked through this little letter, we have found some favorite verses to mean a few different things if you leave them in the context. And I believe no matter how spiritually enlightening they are taken out of their context, their real power lies in leaving them here. That the basic meaning of so many of these favorite verses in Philippians has to do with interpersonal conflict. And if we leave them in that context, I think that's where they are their most powerful. So if you want to take them out and do something else, that's fine. But you have to understand that's taking them out and doing something else. You're free to do that. Guys, what would preachers do? I'm sorry, Russ. Well, don't we all? Don't we all? But if we leave them in here, you're saying, oh, that's kind of reducing what all that verse could mean. And I'm saying, no. I think what it does is opens up what that verse can mean. If we don't watch it, we can miss the whole point of stop the grumbling and fussing. Bless her heart, I would like to meet Euodia and Syntyche someday because I have sat where they sat. It hurts to be there, and you want out of it so bad. But the only way to get out of it is to face it head on and just do it right because it's the right way to do it. And you take whatever comes. Somebody blesses you out, you get blessed out. They send letters around the countryside that won't even let you come in the church door. You take it. You just do it because it's right. And I think that's what Philippians is all about. Well, let me tell you this. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, my third trip now to this part of the country to talk about New Testament things, and you people have always been so gracious And thank you, Russ, for the invitation to be here this time. And I hope that somehow when you read Philippians from now on, it'll be a little bit different book for you. So thank you very much.